What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Roses are a pretty common symbol in a lot of literature and in real life. For example, if somebody were to give you a bouquet of red roses, you'd probably know that they don't just like you as a friend. The example that I just gave was from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, which is just one of many works that uses roses in a symbolic way. But actually, the one that I want to talk about in this video is Beauty and the Beast. Now, when I talk about Beauty and the Beast, I want to make it clear that I'm not just talking about Disney's Beauty and the Beast. That's one of the most recent and most famous iterations of the story, but it's actually much older than that and has taken on multiple versions throughout history. In fact, I'm going to be comparing and contrasting how the rose is used symbolically in the Disney movie versus how it's used symbolically in the traditional French fairy tale. I've talked a little bit before about overt symbols that the characters understand as symbolic versus subtler symbols that the reader can understand as symbolic, but the characters see in a very literal sense. And that's one of the things going on here with the Disney version versus the traditional version. In the Disney version, everybody knows that the rose is a symbol. It's a symbol of the beast's curse. When the enchantress casts the curse on him, she tells him that the rose will bloom until his 21st birthday, but its petals will slowly fall, and when the last petal falls, the curse will be permanent, so he has to break it before then. The rose is symbolic of how much time he has left to break his curse. Now, you could read a lot more into it. For instance, you could say, okay, why a red rose of all things? And then look at the traditional meanings of red roses being associated with romance. The only way to break the beast's curse is for him to fall in love with someone and be loved back in return. So there's definitely the potential to draw deeper symbolic meanings than just the petals represent the time running out. But there is this very surface level amount of symbolism that's going on that's just really obvious and low-hanging fruit as far as identifying symbols. In the traditional French fairy tale that the Disney movie was based on the other hand, the rose isn't really connected to the beast's curse at all. The only thing that really connects it is that, first of all, it's the middle of winter and there's a rose blooming in his garden, and so that gives you a sign that there's something off about his castle, something that's not quite ordinary. And then also, the rose does play a role in bringing him and Belle, or Beauty is her name in the original. The French word for beauty is belle, and so it gets a little bit confusing, but it's la belle et la bête, the Beauty and the Beast. Anyway, moving on, it does bring them together, and so the red rose symbolizing romance could be seen as much like with the Disney version if you read that into why a red rose to symbolize the curse breaking. You could look at it as a symbol of the romance that will develop between them and that will end up breaking his curse. However, it plays a very different role in the story, and based on that, there's different symbolism associated with it. The story basically goes like this. There's a man who has multiple daughters, and when their family fortune is lost, they're forced to move into the countryside and to live much simpler lives than they're accustomed to. The older daughters don't take well to this, but Belle, let's just go ahead and call her Belle, she's a very practical sort of person who understands, that their life has changed and that they can't have the same kind of lifestyle that they used to. So when their father is going into town, he asks them what they would like him to bring them as a gift. And while the older sisters ask for fancy gowns and jewelry and stuff like that, Belle is like, we can't afford that. And so she just asks for a rose. She says that there are no roses growing in this part of the country, and she kind of misses them, so if he could bring her back a rose, she would be very appreciative of that, thinking that's inexpensive and no big deal, and, it's not putting a burden on him. That illustrates her character, so asking for a rose, asking for something very simple, could be seen as symbolizing her modesty, practicality, and willingness to think of others besides herself. However, she doesn't really think it through because it's the middle of winter, and so there are no roses growing. The father is actually able to get the extravagant gifts that the older sisters requested, but he's not able to find a rose anywhere. Until on his journey home, he's lost in a snowstorm and he stops at the beast's castle. And if you think you know where this is going from the Disney version, you'd actually be pretty far off the mark, because in the traditional fairy tale, the beast doesn't show his face, but he welcomes the guy to his castle and he provides food for him and a place to sleep and everything. He has very good hospitality other than, not showing himself because he looks terrifying. However, in the beast's garden, the father sees a rose growing, in the middle of winter. It's the middle of winter outside, all the trees are bare, there's snow on the ground, nothing is growing, but there are flowers in the beast's garden. And so he picks a rose. And that's the moment where the beast turns all vicious and shows up and looks scary and everything. and the Beast tells him that because he's taken a rose without permission, that, violates the hospitality that the Beast was showing to him, and therefore he's going to kill him. The dad begs for his life, and in exchange for letting him live, the Beast demands his daughter, the one that he stole the rose for. Belle, of course, agrees to this, and then the story of Beauty and the Beast kicks off in relative similarity to the Disney version, not entirely. But my point is, do you see how the rose plays a very different role? Instead of being a symbol of the curse, it's the instigator in what will eventually lead to breaking the curse. I've often wondered if the story wouldn't be a little bit more satisfying if it was Belle herself who stole the rose rather than her father. In a way, it is her who stole it because he stole it to give it to her, so he misunderstood her request. She wouldn't have wanted him to steal it for her. But I think it's significant that it was her request that prompted him to steal it. And the reason that I was wondering would it make more sense if she stole it herself is because I'm thinking of the Greek myth of Hades and Persephone, the part where Persephone eats pomegranate seeds and therefore is bound to keep returning to the underworld. It has a very similar feel to it. The young woman who has been sent somewhere against her will, and the thing that was stolen, that because of it, she has to stay there or return there with her monstrous husband. They're both relatively insignificant things, eating 6 pomegranate seeds, stealing a rose. They're both small parts of plants. So I don't know, the Beauty and the Beast story doesn't quite work that way because, again, it's the father who stole the rose. But it's just interesting the kind of forbidden fruit and temptation aspect to it. And then extrapolating from the Hades and Persephone comparison, I also find myself thinking of traditional folklore surrounding fairies and what happens if you eat their food. Sometimes in those stories, if you eat their food, you're trapped in fairyland forever. It's not quite as close of a comparison, but I think that there is something interesting about the idea of consuming or taking something that seems pretty innocuous and then it having long-lasting consequences that end up with someone trapped in a place they'd probably rather not stay. I also find myself thinking of another fairy tale, Hansel and Gretel. It's when the children eat the gingerbread house that they end up captured by the witch. Now, obviously, this is very different because Belle and the Beast are going to fall in love and live happily ever after, whereas Hansel and Gretel ends with the children sticking the witch in her own oven and escaping. But it too follows a very similar pattern. So I'm not sure if the rose was meant to be a part of that pattern or whether that's just kind of an accident. But I do think you could say that in the traditional version of the fairy tale it represents temptation, the temptation to take what doesn't belong to you, to take something more after you've already been given quite a lot, and to misinterpret a request that was made out of humility and selflessness as something greedy that would require you to steal. Even though the rose is what brings the two lovers together initially, it has this negative connotation as well of being associated with greed and temptation. The rose has kind of a duality just in its very nature, actually. It has this blossom with beautiful petals, but then the bush itself and the stalk are covered in thorns. I wonder if one could say that that kind of represents the two main characters, the beautiful woman and the monstrous beast. Or maybe the two sides of the beast. There's the terrifying monster that people see, but then underneath, the handsome prince. You really can't have one without the other. If you want to pick the rose, or in other words, if you want to marry the handsome prince, you have to deal with the thorny bush, or the curse. So really, even though it's in a very different context throughout both the Disney version and the traditional version, the rose is strongly linked with the beast's curse and the breaking of it, and it has this kind of duality that could represent love and selflessness, but also temptation and greed, that could represent the beautiful and kind-hearted woman and the vicious monster, or the vicious monster and the handsome and good-natured prince that's underneath. Of course, the Disney version is not quite so good-natured as the original. In the original, it's really just that he's a good guy who happens to look like a monster. In the Disney version, he has a more unpleasant personality at the beginning. In any case, the rose in Beauty and the Beast is definitely symbolic, and its meanings can vary from one version to the other, but I think that the duality of the beautiful flower and the nasty prickly thorns is very important, as well as the association of the rose with romantic love, and the fact that it, in the original version, was something that was a selfless request interpreted as basically an excuse to steal. I hope that you enjoyed this video and found it to be helpful. If you want to see more from me, be sure to subscribe. I'm done with this video series, but I'll keep posting more videos, and I do that every Monday and Thursday.